thousands of metabolic pathways are going on inside of each and every one of your organs. It's running everything from how your immune cells are able to fight off a virus or bacteria or kill a cancer cell, to how your heart is pumping blood throughout your body so that it can bring oxygen to your tissues. Whatever it is that's happening, it's your metabolism that's actually running you. It's allowing you to live. Well, all of those complicated metabolic pathways, 22% of them actually require a micronutrient as a cofactor. A cofactor means something is needed for the metabolic pathway to work properly. So if you can think about your metabolism as a piece of pie, then a big slice of it is actually needed. You need micronutrients to regulate that. And micronutrients are about 30 essential vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and fatty acids. We know that, at least in the United States, globally probably as well, people are not getting enough of these micronutrients. So around 70% of the population in the United States is not getting enough vitamin D, around 60% is not getting enough vitamin E, magnesium, half the country is not getting enough of, calcium, vitamin K, it goes on and on. So what are the consequences of not getting enough of these micronutrients? We don't see people walking around with rickets very often. We don't see people walking around with scurvy. I mean, their gums aren't falling out. So you think, well, what are the consequences of these micronutrient deficiencies? We don't see them. RDAs have been set. RDAs are recommended daily allowances. They've been set to ensure that we don't get, that we're basically getting enough of these micronutrients. The RDAs are usually set around 2 standard deviations above what would cause a death in a mouse. So even if you're not getting enough of a certain vitamin and mineral, you still have a lot of room before you actually become, clinically sick. But there are a lot of subclinical effects. There are effects that are causing insidious types of damage. So back to our metabolism. There are metabolic pathways that are essential for survival right now that require micronutrients to function. For example, if you're making energy in the form of ATP, well, that requires magnesium. And if you can't make energy, you simply can't live. So that's pretty much a short-term survival function. But there are also metabolic pathways that require micronutrients that are needed for long-term health. For example, repairing damage to your DNA. Well, you don't really have to repair damage to your DNA to live, but you do need to repair it to avoid getting cancer 5 decades down the line. So what happens when you have 2 metabolic pathways that both require the same micronutrient, but you're not getting enough of that micronutrient? What happens to that micronutrient? Well, my mentor, Dr. Bruce Ames, proposed that the metabolic pathway that is essential for survival right now will get that micronutrient at the expense of long-term health pathways. So he calls this the triage theory, and essentially what the triage theory proposes is that during times of micronutrient deficiency or micronutrient inadequacies, there is a very strategic allocation of these micronutrients that are going to the pathways that are essential to keep you alive right now. And the pathways that are not essential for survival right now sort of get the short end of the stick. They're not going to get that micronutrient. And what happens is it leads to insidious types of damage that accumulate over time and can lead to diseases of aging, such as neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, for example. So let's talk about an example of the triage theory, vitamin K. Vitamin K refers to a family of fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin K1 and vitamin K2. We're going to talk just about vitamin K1. I'll circle back to vitamin K2 in a minute. But vitamin K1, also known as phylloquinone, is actually required for plants in order to do photosynthesis, which is how plants make energy. So dark green vegetables are a great source of vitamin K because they need vitamin K to make energy. Well, about 65% of the United States population does not have adequate levels of vitamin K, which is around 90 to 120 micrograms a day, depending on whether or not you're male or female. So vitamin K actually has a lot of important functions inside the cell. One of those functions is it's required for the activation of proteins that are involved in blood clotting, so coagulation. And without vitamin K, those proteins cannot get activated, and you won't be able to clot your blood, which could be pretty bad because you could internal bleeding and have a hemorrhage. So vitamin K is very, very important for this short-term survival function of, coagulation. Vitamin K goes to the liver, where all these proteins involved in coagulation are, and it activates them so that they can then proceed with their function in blood clotting. But there's another function of vitamin K, and that function is involved in pulling calcium out of the blood vessels and arteries and bringing it to places where it should be, like the bones and muscle and other organs. Calcium is an important signaling molecule in many pathways. So these proteins that pull calcium out of the vascular system are also activated by vitamin K. But that's not really an essential function for short-term survival. I mean, you can have calcium build up in your blood vessels and arteries and be just fine for several decades. But calcification of the blood vessels does lead to cardiovascular diseases. In fact, calcification of the arteries is associated with a 4-fold increased risk of cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. It also increases vascular dementia because it's cutting off blood flow to the brain. And dietary calcium is very, very important. However, dietary calcium also very, very easily forms precipitates when it's in contact with phosphorus in the blood vessels. And so if you're getting all this dietary calcium, but you're not allowing those proteins that are important for removing that calcium from the bloodstream and bringing it to your bones and bringing it to your muscle, then you can have a problem because you can have buildup of calcification of the arteries. We know from studies in humans that if you take a human and you cut vitamin K1 out of their diet, so you're making them deficient in vitamin K1, you don't take it all out, but you're really, really limiting the amount of vitamin K1 that they take in. We know that there's absolutely no change in blood coagulation. Your blood clotting still occurs just fine. However, the proteins that are involved in pulling calcium out of the arteries and blood vessels, they don't get activated, which really suggests that there is a triage. When a human is deficient in vitamin K1, that vitamin K1 is going to go to that function that's important for survival right now, coagulation, blood clotting. And we do know that this is the case. There is a tissue-specific allocation of vitamin K1. Vitamin K readily goes to the liver, and the liver is where all these proteins that are involved in blood clotting are activated. Once enough vitamin K1 gets to the liver to activate all those proteins involved in blood clotting, then vitamin K stays around in the bloodstream, in the blood vessels, and activates proteins involved in removing calcium and bringing it to your bones. So it really requires that you get enough vitamin K1 to make sure it's serving both functions for coagulation and for removing calcium from your blood vessels and in your arteries. We also know from looking at mouse studies, there are about 5 different coagulation genes involved in coagulation that are conserved. Mice have them, humans have them. Well, if you get rid of that gene, if you knock it out in a mouse, the mouse dies. It dies actually during embryonic development. It's embryonic lethal, meaning you simply cannot survive without these proteins that are involved in blood clotting, coagulation, which really does suggest that these vitamin K dependent proteins are essential for survival. There's about 6 other proteins that are also dependent on vitamin K1 for activation. But when you knock these proteins out of a mouse, when you genetically get rid of them, these mice don't die, but they end up having diseases of age. So for example, osteocalcin, which needs vitamin K to be activated, those animals, when they get knocked out, they have brittle bones. They have, very weak bones. Gas6 or matrix glah, these animals have calcification of the arteries. TGFB1, these mice get cancer earlier. So these are all diseases of aging that show up if you knock out these genes or proteins that are important for for removing calcium and bringing it to other parts of the body. So I really think that's nice evidence that there is a triage effect that occurs if you are deficient in a certain vitamin, in this case vitamin K1. There is another fat-soluble vitamin K, which is vitamin K2. Vitamin K2 it does not go to the liver to activate blood clotting proteins. It actually stays around in the bloodstream, the vascular system, where it activates those proteins involved in removing calcium from the vascular system. So it's kind of like a backup system. You can convert vitamin K1 into vitamin K2 in your gut. Certain bacteria, microbiome bacteria, are able to do that. However, antibiotics will wipe out about 75% of those bacteria. So there are also food sources of it. The Japanese eat fermented soybeans, so vitamin K2